So here we are on part two of this dealing with the questions on Reddit, where it doesn't seem that Joseph Smith's relationships with certain women seem to be in harmony with what the apologists are telling us in their defense, that he had no intimate unions with those so-called polygamous wives who were polyandrous. In other words, the close to a dozen that were shown by the church as sealed to Joseph Smith, but actually were married to other men, and oftentimes faithful men in the church. So we did part one on that. If you haven't seen part one, probably ought to see that first. And it's called Plural Marriage Among the Latter-day Saints: Myths, Morals, and Misogyny of the Spiritual Wife System. That's what we're looking at. That's number one, and we're heading for number two right now. Let's look at a few more of these. Why did Joseph Smith get sealed to other righteous men's wives? Like we just said, there's really no excuse for it, because it destroys those families in eternity according to LDS doctrine, but garners more women and progeny to Joseph Smith. So these guys have to go out and look for another girl. That works great for a happy marriage, huh? I guess Brian Hales doesn't address that one too well. All right. How do the children and wife feel about that? It basically destroys their marriage, that case, because the men are going after other women. Or they're not going to make it in the celestial kingdom. Or at least not as a god. If Joseph was pressured into polygamy by this angel, why didn't the angel explain things correctly on how things were to be done? I'm not going to address that. I'm not even going to claim to be the most knowledgeable on all of the history, but I have taken a look at the viewpoint of argument on these things from a theological and practical standpoint, and again, the simpler answers are the best, in my opinion. What justified Joseph's sealing to happily newlywed and pregnant mother standpoint? Okay, and this is one of the most sickening stories that I've ever read. Zena Huntington eventually was, well, that was, I guess, her maiden name, if I'm remembering correctly. So she marries Henry Jacobs, and she's a happily married, pregnant for about 6 months girl, when Joseph basically says, you know what, I want your wife. And Henry, the faithful Henry, believing Joseph Smith to be God's prophet, gives up his wife for eternity in this sealing, apparently, if I'm recalling this correctly. And I guess she was a shared asset, we could say, in time. Theoretically, Brian Hales would say there was nothing going on with her and Joseph physically. It was all about eternity, all about stealing Henry's wife and destroying his family for eternity. Well, Brigham took care of that afterwards. He wasn't into sharing. He said something like, it's time for men who are walking in other men's shoes to get out of them. And I believe this happened on the trail to Utah and maybe Iowa. So from that point on, Henry's beautiful, loving wife that he adored went with Brigham. She bore children for Brigham Young, and Henry Jacobs suffered throughout his life in spiritual heartache and agony over the loss of his wife. He wrote some letters to her. I think he eventually went to California, and he wrote some letters from there. His life was destroyed. Thank you, Brigham. Thank you, Heavenly Father. It's difficult to express my feelings for Brigham Young without using foul language, and we don't want to do that here. What was the point of the union with Helen Mar Kimball if Joseph Smith could have been, like, we already kind of looked at that one. Yeah, well, we'd hate to think of the simple answer there now, wouldn't we? So Joseph Smith went to Heber Kimball and said, give me your wife, and then he comes back and said, it was just a test, but I'll take your little girl. And there are people that argue about whether or not Joseph Smith was intimately involved with her. New name Noah wasn't hiding in the closet with a hidden camera, so maybe we just have to guess on that one. Okay, 10. Why did Joseph threaten other leaders if they would lose their apostleship if they didn't take plural wives? Let's look at the unfaithful answer there. And what would that be? What would the logical answer be? Well, I guess that might be kind of like the secret Gadianton band, or it might be like entering into some sort of secret society. Maybe kind of like you read that they do in Skull and Bones, where the guy's doing nasty things naked in a coffin and talking about relationships. In other words, whether or not you believe that scenario to be true, it perfectly demonstrates the concept. Basically, you're not likely to rat out somebody else if you're guilty too. So, drawing people into your wickedness makes it difficult for them to get out of a secret society or a cult environment. And that seems to answer that question just perfectly. But how dare we think of such a thing? Can we think of a faithful sounding answer to that? To believe that Joseph Smith, well, he just wanted them to participate for their own spiritual growth, because, you see, he only had people who would set the example for them in positions of leadership. Of course, then we have to ask, if that was the situation, then why on earth weren't so many people getting involved? When President Gordon B. Hinckley was asked about polygamy on the Larry King Live interview, first of all, should we mention that Hinckley says that he doesn't believe that it's doctrinal. He condemned polygamy and said he did not believe that it was doctrinal. Maybe get to that later. Then he goes on to say, well, it was carefully guarded and only a very small percentage of people entered into it. And who might that be? Well, the leadership of the church. Now, of course, that works perfectly with an alpha male controlling the sexual gratification of the members and using women to reward people who followed him as his closest followers. It works perfectly in a cult mentality. But, of course, that's not the answer that Brian Hales would give us. So what could be the faithful answer to that? I've already offered something like that, but it doesn't seem too consistent with leading by example only, because it wasn't possible for everyone to do that. As a matter of fact, one of the myths that we've heard has been that there were just too many women and someone had to take care of them. Well, we've also probably heard, some of us have noticed, that the Utah census, for instance, showed that there were more men than women. And we really don't have any justification based on that myth either. The facts just don't support the myths. And Joseph Smith obviously wasn't taking care of a bunch of widows. Apparently, the church has decided that about 33 women were sealed to Joseph Smith, or so. A third of them, approximately, were teenage girls. A third of them were other men's wives. A third of them were just, what shall we call them? Random, unfortunate women. So, none of this supports the type of stance that we are hearing from the people saying we have to approach them going uphill to battle, instead of take the logical approach that Joseph Smith was actually a cult leader, an alpha male, controlling the females in the spiritual wife system, rewarding those within the Council of 50 and some of the Danites that were his closest associates, and having all the intimate pleasures that he desired. That seems to be the only logical conclusion that I can come up with, and like the person who made the really short comment, straight to the point, it seems to make the most sense. Henry Jacobs' life being destroyed by Brigham Young is one of the most sickening things I've ever read in my life. If you're into heartbreaks, go ahead and read about it. Okay, reviewing 12, what made it okay for Joseph Smith and early leaders to repeatedly lie about their practice of polygamy. Joseph Smith denies it in various recorded discourses and so forth, and other statements. So, we believe in being honest, true, chaste, benevolent. Do we see any inconsistency in Joseph Smith's behavior? I'm pretty sure that's what this question's getting at. I'm pretty sure that we can see here that he was neither chaste nor honest. He didn't submit Section 132 to the church, so on what basis could he ever be possibly sealed to these women? None of it checks out. Maybe Gordon was right. Polygamy wasn't doctrinal. Then again, Joseph Smith wasn't practicing polygamy. He was practicing the spiritual wife doctrine. Like many doctrines, he seemed to adapt and copy things. Maybe I should say that backwards, or have. Copy and adapt. Whether it's looking at View of the Hebrews, the Late War, the first book of Napoleon, various things that appear to have contributed to the Book of Mormon, maybe some Rosicrucian monks and what they might have had to say. and various other Masonic or Enochian legends that went into the Book of Mormon and or the book 5th chapter, especially the Book of Moses, things that reek of illuminated Freemasonry, which was a big concept or a big topic in Joseph Smith's day after William Morgan revealed certain aspects of the secretive and murderous nature of Freemasonry and was killed for the sake of the oath, just as we read in Moses chapter 5, where was it Lamech killed a younger man for the sake of the oath who had revealed some of their secrets. Why was it okay for Joseph Smith to reseal himself to the Partridge Sisters? Oh, the Partridge Sisters. In other words, the fake sealing. If he was already so-called sealed or married to these young girls, why did he redo it in front of Emma? Gee, I'd hate to think that he was just trying to make it look like it was just happening then with Emma's approval after he somehow managed to convince her to accept this sort of thing and didn't want to blow his cover that he was already involved with these girls. And didn't Emma kick out the Lawrence sisters, who were their foster daughters, whose endowment or inheritance of like $3,000 they had taken liberties of utilizing while these girls were entrusted to their care after their parents died? Weren't they like 16 and 19 years old, and didn't Joseph get caught with one of them in the bedroom, one of many bedrooms, coincidentally, in the mansion house? You've heard that in the Lord's house are many mansions. Well, in Joseph's mansion were many bedrooms, and that was apparently built by commandment of the Lord, that Joseph Smith should have a wonderful house where he could entertain guests, or maybe that young girls could entertain him while Emma was out doing other things. So she caught him in the bedroom, and out went the girls. He apparently is listed as being their husband, or in other words, they are supposedly sealed to him, these teenage girls that were his foster daughters. Wow. Joseph Smith and Bill Clinton seem to have a few things in common, don't they? I've posted some of these thoughts in fragments, but here we got a bunch of them. So when we view these things in their entirety, what we see is there's a pattern. There's a pattern that Joseph Smith's lifestyle seems to be a little bit more like Bill Clinton or Kobe Bryant than a prophet of God is supposed to be. It seems like Mr. Hale's argument falls apart. It has no logical basis. It destroys families in eternity and just makes zero sense. The real sense is made by the guy who made the comment, or guy or girl who made the comment at the bottom, which was rather on the explicit side, and that Joseph Smith's basically addiction to satisfying his carnal desires seems to be the guiding point for his actions, and the one that's consistent with all these behaviors. I hope this video has helped bring some things together, make sense out of those things that maybe don't make sense in the minds of those who have tried to comprehend and wrap their mind around arguments that are given by apologists such as Brian Hales. Arguments that actually make no sense because they're based on a false premise, just as the Hugh Nibley argument was about the Book of Mormon challenge. The default isn't that Joseph Smith was a righteous man, because his behaviors are not consistent with that. The church apologists have to keep changing their stance continuously to fit the scenario, because apparently Jesus keeps changing his mind, shifting his position, and lying to us as he changes his doctrine and contradicts his own words in the scriptures that are literally said to be given to us directly by revelation, either through translation of an ancient record, through his peepstone, or direct revelation from God currently speaking through his mouth in the Doctrine and Covenants and multiple revelations. Apparently Jesus has got some of the same problems Joseph Smith said, or has demonstrated. Jesus contradicts himself in the Book of Mormon. He contradicts himself in the Book of Mormon with other scriptures, such as those that are found in the Book of Moses and in the Doctrine and Covenants. He contradicts what he said he would do in terms of following his own law that he might not cease to be God. Everything we see here is a story of contradiction or inconsistency, as this good person has noted. Inconsistency in the story, in the theme, and in the testimony. I give my testimony that Joseph Smith evidently was more like what he appears to be than what the apologists tell us he is. And I do it in the name of the Age of Reason, written by Thomas Paine. Amen.
So I'm going to bring the spiritual life system videos over, the 10 that were done basically on the Joseph Jackson testimony about what went on in Nauvoo with the spiritual life system, the Danites, Council of 50, that sort of thing. And I'll be uploading those right away as well, so we'll have them on this channel too, and probably create some new commentary on those as well. Anyway, thanks for your views and shares.
You saw it on the Mormon Truth video channel.